Welcome to the Otherweb. Our guest today is Rick Edmonds. Rick is the media business analyst for the Poynter Institute, a school and study center for working journalists. He has been doing research and writing for 25 years on the financial decline of legacy media, newspapers particularly, and the rise of new media alternatives. Rick, welcome to the show.
I appreciate the invitation. Looking forward to talking with you.
I'm looking forward to it as well. So you've been a media analyst for over 15 years now, I guess, maybe one of the leading media analysts in the U.S.?
Probably even more than 20. I decided back then that, particularly with newspapers, this was likely to be an area of big change and hasn't stopped yet. So find it a great beat to try to cover.
All right. So as you analyze the media today, what do you see?
Let's start with right now, because 2024 is proving a very difficult year for really almost all media, certainly all news media. And my biggest focus is newspapers, which are in kind of on the rocks financially in the first place, and a combination of two things I really don't want to see go down. Advertising and especially building audience are both down. But that extends, and you've read the same stories I do about even some of the bigger digital startups and big networks like NPR or a big paper like the Washington Post are having to cut back. So that's a tough period we've arrived at. Let me talk maybe first about newspapers with a little bit of reference to other things. That with newspapers, the first thing that started to change right at the turn of the century, you and maybe some of your readers don't remember quite back that far, but classified advertising was just huge and a very high profit item. All you had to do was have people there taking the calls. And on a Sunday paper at a big city, you might see 3 or 4 full sections of that. And between the Craigslist and various other kinds of things that facilitated vertical choices for shoppers, and on the internet, you could have lots of space instead of rationing it out. But that business very quickly began to move away from newspapers. So that was a concern. Some particular reporters who weren't caring too much about the business side didn't notice it right away. But that did sort of set off an awareness that digital was rising and newspapers would have to find their way in that world. Their first steps were pretty halting, even including the New York Times, which is a big success story now. Their first offering was a kind of a premium paywall protected thing to see their most popular columnists. Columnists hated it because their traffic wore down and so forth. But the newspapers really didn't begin to get their act together until early in the 2010s. And around that time, Facebook and Google went from being a terrific challenge in terms of traffic and the amount of time spent to being very potent competitors in the ad space locally as well as nationally. And that was a big blow. And the strategy came to be to see if they could make peace with that situation and with the providers, the internet giants who were referring a lot of traffic. So that became, and it was surprising to me, sort of from a old-timey background, that suddenly more traffic was coming from Google and Facebook referrals than from people coming to your site and wanting to see what you had to offer. That continued for a while, but I think that's one of the things just within the last 3 to 5 years that have been changing. And the platform companies, especially Facebook, have become less and less interested in news. That kind of wound down, or in case of Facebook, cut off their journalism philanthropies, and that traffic, which was so critical, is shifting. All steps of the way with startups, there's been a splintering of the audience. The old notion of coming to a newspaper site or another news site, CNN or whatever, for sort of one-stop shopping for all your needs, all things to all people, that's kind of ancient history now. So the newspapers and others are faced with very, once again, they need to reinvent themselves to find their place in the sun and get a lot of traffic. So I guess that's my overview, but any of those things are perhaps worth talking about in more depth.
It sounds like there's at least 3 different topics here. I want to start from the first one because that's one I haven't heard from anybody yet, actually. Right? Everybody talks about Google and Facebook and what they did to newspapers. Nobody talks about Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace. So except you. So my first question there is, why would somebody go to Craigslist as opposed to going to the classified section of their local newspaper? Seems like Craigslist is local only anyway, right? They segregate themselves by city. So why can't a newspaper compete on a fair basis there?
Sure. For classifieds, that business was predominantly local. It wasn't advertising national products. It was people who, let's say, had a used car to sell or an apartment to sublet, or it actually had a fairly thriving personal section. I saw the beautiful you in the grocery store this time. So who are you? From people placing the ads, it had a great appeal because it was free as opposed to the classifieds. And the results were pretty good. And the appeal to readers, it was not at all an attractive site. I don't think it's been improved too much since, but go to it by category. Same as classifieds. I'm interested in a used car. What's there? The second thing for people placing the ads, and I kind of went fast over this point, was the way classifieds were priced. It was per word or per line. So they were these kind of odd reading things that had a lot of abbreviations and that type of thing. You would talk about the case of a used car. You could say as much as you wanted, and you could include a picture of it and so forth. So it improved the state of the art in quite a few ways and caught on quickly.
But why couldn't the newspaper compete in the same way? At least the digital version of the newspaper, there's also no space constraint. So on the website, you can allow everything that Craigslist allows. Why didn't they?
If you'd asked a newspaper executive at the time, they would have said, well, yeah, we know there's just Craigslist out there, but it's not very high quality. It's got some, very marginal ads, escort services and that type of thing. And we don't want to compete with ourselves, was kind of the idea, because print was the gravy train. Digital was the thing you ought to be kind of aware of and began experimenting, but there was no particular expectation that it would be big. And one of the executives of that time, Tony Ritter, who ran Knight Ritter, was at a big meeting of editorial people one time, and somebody asked him after dinner, "What keeps you up at night?" And he said, "Online classifieds." And the editorial people hated that. I mean, come on, they want some glowing statement about the importance of press and democracy. But from a financial point of view, that was right on. That was sort of the first step in what grew and grew and grew.
Can that be reversed now? Because, I sold a car through Facebook Marketplace. So I know the method works even for larger items, right? But the question is, again, Facebook Marketplace is local. People don't buy the car from all over the country. Only people from Austin looked at our ad. So why couldn't I have done it in the local Austin newspaper, which I don't even know what it's called, which is a problem in itself. But
Statesman American or American Statesman, I get it confused. Well, yes and no. Some sorts of shopping, let's say Zillow for real estate, people may be moving to Austin, so they want to see Austin, but it's not a main way of selling national products, and a little bit more gets into the micro transaction and what kind of phone service you're going to subscribe to or mattress you're going to buy. And I think basically the newspapers kind of slept through it before their business got taken away from them. There's not much of a way to come back at that particular line of business now. There are great number of possibilities or theoretical things that might work, but that isn't really one of them.
It sounds like, at least with Craigslist, maybe newspapers might have a comparative advantage because they have the audience coming for some other reason first. But with Facebook, they don't have that advantage anymore.
Yeah, and they had a huge audience to draw from. But and to be sympathetic to their point of view, this is a major part of their income stream, and it's even more profitable than just its place in revenue, which was significant. So they were very reluctant to do something that could supplant it. And some of that argument got made over a period of years about digital sites. And in the early days, most sites were free. Some still are. Of course, many of the digital-only competitors are free. So that was kind of the same idea. We make our money by charging for subscriptions, charging advertisers a pretty high rate, and that's been a great business. Will continue to be a great business. So why do flirt with radical change? And you or your listeners might or might not be familiar with a guy named Clayton Christensen, who was a leading sort of business guru. There you go. Okay. So as you know, as your readers know, he said, do compete with yourself. Don't. That's kind of a dumb reason to rule out a potential new revenue stream. And his sort of second thing was to figure out a job to do for users. And in the case of Craigslist, I think we just said that it did a job for people trying to sell stuff, and it did a job for people who were looking for goods, and the price was very reasonable, or it was free, and it worked. It worked efficiently. So it was indeed a disruptor. And it's interesting because we actually, at the Poynter Institute where I work, which is a school and study source for working journalists, Craig Newmark is one of our benefactors. He started a $5 million program for ethics, which is a big thing in our rather modest scale of operations. And though the site was free, it became so valuable that he became a millionaire many, many times over. And he's an interesting guy. He's quite shy and hardly what you would think of as a big media executive, but he sure had the winning formula.
Yeah. Well, I think it's free except for cars and job offers, or like
apartments in big cities too. And just even if that's the only part where there's a charge, that itself generates a huge amount of income.
And as far as the ethics center at Poynter, I'm going to be interviewing Kelly McBride in a week or two, I think, from there. So we'll get to dig into the ethical side of things because I'm really interested in that as well, as you can see from the rest of my books here.
We may or may not get to AI, which I'm fascinated by as a business phenomenon, though I don't understand the tech side that much better than anybody else. But that really...
I'm the opposite because I run an AI company. So
pool our knowledge and we'll know something. But that in itself raises some potent ethical questions. And it's all trickier because if we're in the early stages, you're trying to look ahead, 2-3 moves as it's doing chess and see where it's going to be and be ready for it when you get there.
All right. So I want to get to that if we have enough time. But for now, I want to also unpack the things that you mentioned in the beginning. So the second item in that list was Google and Facebook, which, if I may describe it in the crudest terms, they took away all the traffic of the newspapers, and then they gave some of it back and wanted the newspapers to be happy that they received anything in return.
Yes, I think that's fair. And there's been this tension, continues to the present day, and there have been a bill in Congress that would not have passed, enshrine the principle that they ought to be paying for the content that they use, and that they use it to build traffic, and they use it once they have the traffic to sell the advertising. Now they would say, well, and they have done this in other countries. You don't want us, don't do business with us. That's fine. We'll drop you. Well, newspapers don't really, or particularly in that period I talked about where the referrals were so high, papers don't want to do that because they did rely on the business. So, yes, they have, to my mind, I saw you had Jeff Jarvis on. He would certainly disagree with this, but I think they've exploited the market power they have over newspapers and been overall a big player in the economic problems that the newspaper industry. And I'm sure they affect other portions of the media universe in some similar ways. Newspapers I'm both most familiar with, and I think that's where it's hurt the most.
So can you help me steelman the anti-Jeff Jarvis argument? Essentially, you're saying they exploited the system. I would think that Professor Jarvis's counter-argument would say they followed fair use. They only used a small portion of the content. They linked back to the source. There's evidence that they did send traffic. The link wasn't just there for show. So what is the exploitation here? And if we want them to pay, on what basis can we make that claim?
Well, I think there's several different ones. I'd say Jeff has a point that you can't put the tech genie back in the bottle and say, man, it was great the way it was before. So well, no, he's pretty good at talking for himself, so I shouldn't put words in his mouth. But Google's here to stay. Live with it. That'd be one thing. And he is sympathetic to the notion that these are great advances for communications. If there's some collateral damage to more traditional media, that's the way of the world. That new things come along, and companies that many examples in the industrial world, companies that were very successful at a certain point, they've kind of run their lifespan. So he doesn't think it's particularly tragic. I guess he probably thinks it's unfortunate that so many media outlets are in so much trouble. And he would make the argument, which again I think sounds totally without basis, that the newspaper industry was very, very slow to figure the thing out and very, very slow to turn itself around. A characteristic of most media companies, but particularly newspapers, very siloed. They have the printing operation, the circulation operation, the newsroom, and they communicate with each other, but it's not very susceptible to, which you maybe see a little bit at the Washington Post right now. It's not real susceptible to going in and say, guys, this really isn't working, and we're going to do a huge pivot. I think the argument, on the other hand, is that maybe a little less true now, but because those companies own other companies, WhatsApp or YouTube, they're effectively pretty near monopolies, and they have the ability to undercut prices. That's one of the things they did in establishing their dominance in local advertising. And the case, he doesn't agree with this, but the case that they've really been a primary factor in the decline of news media, I think that merits attention, and that's certainly part of the debate in Congress. And it's moved some now to the states, since Congress has been slow to act, that they ought to be regulated. They ought to be made to negotiate for the content they take from publications, who have all the expense, and it's considerable, of gathering that content and then editing it into usable form for users.
So let me play devil's advocate here for a second. With the exception of the antitrust portion in your answer, everything else that you outlined is utilitarian, right? You're talking about the desirable or undesirable effects on the media, on these companies, etc. But is there an ethical or legal basis to actually challenge what they've done? Antitrust is obviously a good answer to that, but is there something else that they did that is wrong or that they actually need to pay for, right? We have fair use law. They seem to be mostly following it. I don't think that Facebook posts typically plagiarize an article, right? They only include some small portion.
Well, to overstate a little, but in service of our disagreement on this, if you build a big company and one of the operating premises is to steal intellectual property from other people, that's not okay. It's not okay as a matter of ethics. It's not okay as a matter of law. Kind of hard to prove in this case, but I do think it's fair to say that in this relationship between the two, it's a very unequal match. They kind of have the news media over a barrel, and you need us as much or more than we need you, and that's kind of how the situation has evolved.
Mm-hmm. But I guess this is exactly the part that I would like to unpack: stealing intellectual property versus fair use, which is basically use a small portion, link back to the source, send the traffic back, etc. Which of the two has social media actually done?
That's a question. It's a good question in the first place. It's a question that's been litigated, was litigated even before the digital era. The Associated Press, in its long life, goes back to the middle of the 19th century, has been quite careful to try to protect the longer version of their pieces. You have to be an AP subscriber, which is quite expensive to use everything and to use the articles in full. You can take the headline, and then that's fair use. And a sort of tough question is just how much of a summary statement, let's say for the sake of argument, it's a headline and 2 paragraphs. Is that fair use? Is that in a period where so many people are skimming and that's so easy to do? Is that kind of now getting into same principle? Somebody else is taking the expense and quality control of making it, and then you're just helping yourself.
And there is some case law there that is very limited. This is why I'm asking, can we really say that they've stolen the content if case law is basically not really telling us that they've crossed the line? Nobody knows where the line is.
Yeah, you may have followed it more closely than I do. I do think that it's not fully resolved, and to some extent the rulings have cut a little each way. And I don't think it varies state to state too much.
No, as far as I know, it doesn't vary state to state, and case law is very limited. AP is actually the main litigant in most of these cases, and they've only won cases where basically somebody stole their content verbatim and it was a large amount of content, right? They've never litigated a case where somebody just took a snippet, and they certainly never won a case like this, which is why, it's even a business risk for my company because we take the headline from news items, right? We produce our own summary. We don't use any other text from the original article. But I always have this in mind as a possible business risk, which is, well, there is a chance somebody will come after us. It's just nobody has ever won a case like this. I wanted to ask you, since you mentioned other countries have actually gotten Facebook to pay, what difference do you see in general between the US and other countries in this regard and as far as newspapers are doing?
Well, I do think this will lead quite quickly to the exact question you asked. But I think in the US, Facebook and Google are sort of the home team. They're big, they're mighty, but they're the Kansas City Chiefs of this particular line of business. It's the reverse in many foreign countries. This is an American thing that's come over and wreaked havoc with well-established, very high-quality and specialized media to their countries, and particularly where there's a different language involved, like Germany, Spain. It's a contained national market. We're not talking about U.S. media and other English language media, which is consumed all over the world. So quicker focus on the problem, smaller countries, different framework of legal regulation and relationships. So Australia, good example. Canada is pretty much gone this way. Spain, France. It's a real trend internationally. And we at Poynter have a terrific contributor Anna Schifrin, who's a professor at Columbia, and she actually travels the world to report on the specific instances. And Australia, for example, basically passed a law requiring the platform companies to negotiate. They couldn't mandate that the negotiations would lead to a resolution, but to negotiate with media companies. And by and large, the platform companies have agreed. Now, the terms of those agreements are confidential. It's not 100% transparent. It favors big companies because they have the most content. But it's a pretty powerful start. And in Spain, particularly, I think in France too, Google and or Facebook have taken that approach I mentioned before. That okay, this is the new law. We're going to stop doing business here. We're not going to offer our services.
And that leads to my next question, specifically with regards to Facebook. It perhaps is less pertinent to Google. But Facebook has been essentially hinting to the world over the past few years that news is not profitable to them, right? It used to be that news attracted a lot of traction and produced a lot of traction on the system, and there was no PR downside to having it on your platform. I think after 2016, they got a lot more downside because now a stray news item can create a really bad PR disaster for them. On the other hand, the traction on news discussions on Facebook is much lower. So they're de-emphasizing it on Threads, they're de-emphasizing it on Instagram. They're pretty much saying that they're not making any money off of this. So how much negotiating power would a newspaper have against Facebook if Facebook thinks that they don't need this market?
Declining, to be sure. I think the negotiating position is stronger with Google. But let me say a couple things about Facebook. As you said, and I'd say it'd be even more so that there's problems for Facebook in running news, and to some extent they're correct. There's sort of polluted material coming there. There are issues of taste and libel, and so they may just, for those reasons, want to steer clear of it to make their site as attractive to as many people as possible. Secondly, this has been going on in a very active way for probably about 3 years. The loss of that referral call traffic and the erosion of the relationship. But I used to listen to Facebook earnings calls, and it was on the way even 5 or 6 years ago. And I particularly remember Zuckerberg saying one time about the preference for other kinds of material than news, that a picture of your kids in Halloween costumes is really better content than a news story.
It was probably a change that occurred after 2016 when Facebook was seen as this great villain and they got all this terrible PR because, well, the number one story on Facebook that year in terms of number of shares was the Pope endorses Donald Trump. So clearly that wasn't good for Facebook when the number of shares of fake content was larger that year of the number of shares of real content.
And I don't really want to shift to Google, but personally, this is not an official policy of the Poynter Institute. I'm something of a fan of Google. I use various of their products every day, many times a day. I use that for my email and for Google Docs to write stories, and Google searches to begin the work of reporting. So I don't begrudge them their success. Facebook's a little different. I still, I guess, see them as basically a destroyer of the media, new, high quality, high aspiration civic news to which I've devoted my whole career. I'm not on Facebook. I boycott Facebook. They're doing just fine without me. But
I'm on Facebook only insofar as the ads manager is running through my account and my marketing people are running it. Otherwise, I don't log in. But since you mentioned Google, that you like them, let me see if we can torch that bridge too. You mentioned antitrust. It seems like Google is a much bigger potential offender in that space than Facebook ever was, right? They are essentially paying other companies to eliminate the competition, which, as far as I remember my antitrust studies, typically was a no-no until 20 years ago we kind of stopped enforcing it.
Yeah, they're vulnerable to that. And when the interest in regulating Google flares up, and this is maybe a little apart from the question of expropriating the product of news companies, it goes back to sort of the old days of regulating the telephone company. That some people say we got to break it up and put these different parts in different companies, and that would be at least somewhat fair to potential competitors, and particularly Google, but Facebook too. They have this pattern of either buying the competition and makes our economic sense for them, or very aggressively competing or disadvantaging those companies, sometimes in access from their own platforms. So they, as your comment suggested, act like monopolists.
Yeah. I mean, and buying the competition is one thing, right? But I'm thinking more about the fact that the majority of people in the world use the Chrome browser. It is an excellent product. It costs a lot of money to create. Why is it free? And how is this not dumping, for example? Right? Which is an anti-competitive practice that we typically used to regulate against.
And each of those things I mentioned, Google Search, the kind of the original and mother of it all, and Google Chrome and Google Mail, so forth. They're all products that increase the user's affection for Google and kind of reinforce that people take a close look at whatever the next big thing is they bring along.
Well, I think essentially most of what they do is lock people into Google search as the default option. And that is the big way to monetize people. But again, we typically viewed this as a no-no when you dump the price of one product just to lock a customer into your other product.
I hope this doesn't sound like a side excursion, but I think one of the things kicking around here, I've seen it in different contexts with regulators. They have this very unfortunate way that they're working with frame of reference that's 20 years old. And times have changed, but how they enforce antitrust, or for instance, in the case of newspapers, they block mergers based on the issue sometimes that two newspaper organizations are on bordering counties. Well, that isn't the be-all anymore. But I guess a more succinct way to say it is I don't think the regulation overall has caught up. And let's not forget that part of their power is they can employ tremendous force of lobbyists and lawyers. So getting to the finish line in regulation is very difficult for a number of the reasons we've just discussed.
Yeah, I'm certainly in an industry where the regulation that you describe also affects us a lot because it limits the exiting options of startups if mergers and acquisitions become that much harder. And I'm thinking about the purpose of antitrust. And it doesn't seem to me like the purpose was to block mergers and acquisitions. The purpose was to block abuse of monopoly power in the form of things like dumping or bundling products together that shouldn't be bundled together. But those two things seem to be quite prevalent in the market, whereas mergers and acquisitions are not. So,
Yep, I think that's fair. And I can think of a lot more, starting with YouTube and WhatsApp, where the merger has been the big power in the industry soaking up and absorbing the next one. And search, I don't think other search engines have made much of a dent. Google's a better product. It's free. I think that the Facebook people are pretty talented at this of seeing what's coming along that may displace Facebook, at least for some of their users. And, it's a sort of the axiom that people really aren't on Facebook to the degree that some of us are, not me, but TikTok, WhatsApp, and various others are kind of becoming a more congenial place for them to spend their time.
Again, this is a big aside, but I think the fastest growing product within Facebook is Instagram. So that's where most of their growth is. All right. I want to switch gears a little bit because when we talked about the news media so far, mostly we talked about their problems with traffic monetization, things like that. They're sort of like the wrapper around the product. The question I have is the product itself worth as much as it used to be worth? Or is it now worth less because everybody's writing about the same national stuff for the most part? And so you just have more supply of this product. So maybe the product itself is not as valuable.
Fair point. I think particularly obvious nationally, but it's becoming more true locally with the start of nonprofits and smaller but high quality local news sources. People have a lot of options that are free. So that decreases the value. And unfortunately, paradoxically, newspapers are a good case in point. I think some of this is entertainment too. Rather than the incumbent properties being less expensive, they're getting more expensive all the time. And again, to take an example from newspapers that I know best, it's become much more expensive to print a paper, serving that part of the audience that wants a printed paper. And it's very difficult at the point. Some places it's hard to do to get people to go deliver the paper and throw it on your front stoop and this kind of thing. And for that and some other reasons, they've raised the price a lot. And people who are longtime loyal subscribers don't drop papers as quickly as you think they might when the prices go up. But I think part of what's happened in the last 2 years is they're hitting the ceiling on that. And they're still able to sell product that to some extent at very low prices and then bring people along, but they're losing many more at the end of those trial periods, or people who've been paying full freight for a few years.
So if I examine this trend and I see less revenue, not just because the monetization options dried up, but mostly because people are paying fair value for the product, and with more competition, that value is lower. On the other hand, the printing costs went up, the real estate costs went up. Something has to go down to compensate, and it's going to be wages, right?
Yeah, it's going to be a lid on wages. They do. I mean, I should say they have and deploy some options. Selling printing plants is one of them. They don't need all that space. They sit on a very valuable piece of real estate, so that's one way to replenish income. And many have moved out of very centrally located, sometimes sort of imposing office space, and they can go move into generic office space and save a lot of money that way. But the pressure on keeping costs down is intense. And our readers are typically in the news side of the business, and they just feel a pinch in many ways, and opportunities to move are limited, and you kind of work under the sword of you never know when the next cut is coming and whether you're going to be one of the ones who's cut or some other people that are crucial to your team's operation. So it's a challenging situation for the workers. My read is, for all that, young people still want to get in the business. There are opportunities for people who have the combination of journalism skills and better social media tech skills than older folks do. And there's still this sort of core of people who really, really believe in the mission, and they're going to keep doing it even under adverse circumstances. Many of the nonprofit startups come from experienced journalists who sort of have that sense of mission and don't want to stop, even if there's not a place for them at the local newspaper anymore.
So that leads us down the doomsday path of now talking about AI. Because if we're already seeing that even without it, the biggest pressure is on wage expense, right? And on either cutting journalists or paying them less. Now we suddenly have a competitor on the scene that is becoming better at writing, which is one of the skills that journalists had a near monopoly on, right? Journalists were good at uncovering facts and good at writing about those facts in an eloquent manner. Now there's a tool that is becoming good at writing about stuff in an eloquent manner. It is terrible at uncovering facts, but maybe you don't need it for that. You just hire a PI and a model, and that's cheaper than having two journalists. How is the industry going to handle that?
Well, I would only disagree, and feel free to disagree with me, that it's not very good at right now. It's not very good at writing either, and it's stiff. It lacks some of the storytelling, human touch that a good writer can impart. So, to the extent it's used, and it is being used more all the time, it's a little bit in combination. You have the AI do the chores, the sort of basic outlining and all that, and then you have a writer do the finishing touches. But you're absolutely right, and a big part of it's one of two or three issues, but the notion of again, how much help should news organizations provide in building the vocabulary and building the skill level of the AI products? What do they have to gain? What do they have to lose by holding back? And then the sort of the flip side of that is how aggressive should they be in their use of AI, while its imperfections are being corrected, but the imperfections are still pretty big.
Yeah, so a few notes on that. First of all, obviously, what you said is the transition stage, right? Where journalists would still be doing the final writing, but they will have tools that save them time. We're actually, okay, my PR people are going to kill me for saying this, but we're about to launch that product for journalists to save them time on the most annoying chores, like figuring out what the URL slug needs to look like, which 5 headlines to test for SEO purposes, things like that, right? So that's easy. That's already doable right now. But when you say that currently AI is not good at writing, I would counter back that products that were tuned for a generic purpose of doing everything in the world are not good at writing journalistic content. But when you fine tune a model for journalistic content, it's good at journalistic content. And that can already be done essentially by anyone. Like we have a few of those models, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's dozens of companies out there that have done this because the data sets are not hard to get.
Well, I personally, we at Poynter have a long-time relationship with the Associated Press, and I've covered them in many different contexts. The fellow who's been their sort of futurist and planner, not well-known man named Jim Kennedy, he's doing that for 20 years. He's very good at it. And in one of our visits, he was talking about how they really wanted to begin using AI, machine learning, I think that quite called AI at that point, experiment with it, actually doing articles. And one of the first test cases was very rudimentary game results in sports, high school sports. And you could very easily tell the difference between one of those articles that was written by a machine and one that was written by the robot. And then, in fact, as a reader and a sports fan, I still read many articles that read like they were written by a robot, whether they were or not. So, in those, and many different contexts, people are looking for the information rather than an elegant story. But a school of thought now is that news organizations need to compete where they have the advantage and become basically mainly products that have depth and storytelling and engage an audience that way. However big the audience is, it's not going to be the size of the newspaper audiences of old days, but maybe that's where it's headed.
I would say from my vantage point, where journalists have the advantages in stories where the identity of the journalist matters to the story, right? The old adage is don't be a part of the story. Like if it's the news, then it doesn't matter who wrote it, but AI then can write it just as well, or at least will be able to.
Yeah, that's one way. I mean, I would also say if you're reading about the Israel war or the Ukraine war, you really and you care, you want boots on the ground over there. People really significant reporting and editing resources, and that's what New York Times and Associated Press and some of the broadcast outlets provide. But it's hard to come by, and I guess that's one of the things to watch over the next few years is whether AI kinds of assembling of information can be a pretty good substitute.
Well, and boots on the ground don't need to know how to write, right? They can basically send stuff in Excel spreadsheets or shorthand.
Yes, divided between the hunter-gatherers and the people who refine it. And the news magazines in the old days, that they were very strictly organized that way. You get all the dispatches, and then you'd have a group in New York who turned it into stories, magazine.
And let's talk about another trend that will also potentially be accentuated by AI. A lot of people, if you ask them what is wrong with the media, the first thing that they would say is fragmentation into left and right. And now within the right, you have additional fragmentation. Within the left, you're starting to get that as well. Do you see that reverting to the mean at some point? Or is it only going to get worse because as the price of producing content goes down, the logical endpoint is every article is written for an audience of one?
That is an endpoint. Yeah, well, in a word, yes, I see a little bit of it reverting to higher value of a more neutral approach and stories that don't have discernible bias. There's a big long debate about whether any of us can be purely objective, or whether we bring our views into stories, whether consciously or not. And looked at it a little bit more carefully, it's clear that several of the cable networks, and Fox is the big example, and MSNBC doesn't have as big an audience, they live for being highly partisan. That's their thing, and to go back and forth. The big networks, much less so. Debatable whether Washington Post and New York Times are very left-leaning, but there are other sources. AP, I actually think the Wall Street Journal news section is pretty neutral, and CNN more or less endeavors maybe they are. So people say, because they say they want something that's more neutral and less opinionated, but maybe in their actual, what they pick to look like is not totally consistent with that. But I do think it's recognized as something to be sought out, and something you, if that's what you want, you probably work at it a little bit and you can find it. Or conversely, some people say, well, I sample views on both sides and then I decide what I want. It's not entirely immaterial to this article that there's been, as you know, a tremendous shift, not over just in a year or two, but over a decade or so, that many more voters describe themselves as independent or no party affiliation than Republican or Democrat. So that's reestablishing a mass in the middle. Parenthetically, terrific guy named James Hamilton has written several good books on the media, and one of them is historical, and he sort of pinpoints it in way back, like in the late part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, particularly in local context, but basically it was a good business decision to try to go down the middle. You were not the only game in town, but the dominant game in town, and you didn't want to annoy people on either side. So that was a good choice. With fragmenting media, as you suggested earlier in this conversation, that probably is not certainly not as true. Maybe it's not true at all.
And that's what I'm trying to figure out. Does it stop at Fox versus MSNBC, or are we going into Fox versus Newsmax versus OAN? And then at some point, Newsmax people also break into 5 small groups that are watching different things and don't actually know what the other guy just saw. Like, are we just getting into a point where everybody has their own kind of brain in a vat kind scenario of what they are being fed?
I don't think that's what everyone wants. And boy, if you don't want to watch OAN and Newsmax, I don't know that I've ever watched either. You don't have to. A bad reputation, just steer clear of them. It's kind of like porn. If you want to watch it, you watch it. If you don't, go near it.
For what it's worth, we pride ourselves on sampling from a lot of different sources. Uh-huh. Both of those names are outside. Right. Right. So we have a very wide overtone window, but they're not in it.
You were coming up to a point that concerns us, and we're certainly not unique at Poynter, of so-called pink slime and basically fake news sites. There are companies that set up shop and call themselves, I'm in Tampa Bay, they'll call themselves the Tampa Bugle. And it looks like a actual news site, and it's kind of written as if it was, except it's really to push an agenda. Most of it conservative, but I don't think that's necessarily needs to be the case. So fuzzing the line between what you can trust and where people are making an expensive effort to make everything reliable, versus somebody who's just really sort of peddling ideology and a point of view.
So I guess that exists, but I have to say that what I'm observing even more of is creating these kind of fake news sites just to drive traffic, right? And I mentioned the Pope endorses Donald Trump and stuff like that, right? That was done by an outlet that was set up by some kids in Macedonia, I think, called Breaking the Fed or something like that. And they made a lot of money through advertising, and that was the entire point. They didn't actually know whether Donald Trump was good or bad, or care whether he was good or bad. My PR guy sent me a website yesterday. I think it was newyorkbreaking.com or something like that. And he asked me, like, can you tell who created this? And I'm digging into it. And within 2 minutes, I'm just seeing the name of the ad networks that this is affiliated with, right? It's just an ad generating machine. And then I take the input of the articles, I input it into a search engine, and I immediately find it's just stolen from elsewhere, right? Typically just copy pasting one article from MSN after another. So do you think fake news, which is fake on purpose, as in disinformation, is as big a problem as junk news, which is just stuff created for the purpose of driving ad revenue? Whether or not it's true or not, real or not, who cares?
Hard for me to make that distinction. They're both very bad phenomena of the current age. I'll mention that at Poynter we're home to PolitiFact, which was one of the first debunkers of false claims by politicians. It was back before 2009, before it had morphed into what we see now. And part of that is a program called MediaWise, where we're trying to help young people, particularly, do it yourself to figure out what's real, what's fake. I find that, as a person who's not versed in art and design, particularly difficult with photos, but there's some good ways to do that if you know how. So the exercise of trying to get more people able to make that distinction is in our view, very worthwhile. And we find a lot of funder interest in that from the philanthropies.
All right, last question. I like to end these things on a hopeful note. We've talked about a lot of things breaking. How do we fix them, and what can we build out of the stuff that we have left?
Well, media in general, again, newspapers are my specialty, have been very successful the last few years with newsletters. That's why we see newsletters everywhere, why your inbox is full of them, where you fill something out and they've got your email address. And that has a virtue that it's very, it gets your brand out, and it's a very good way to find the people who might be interested in subscribing. And that's already big. I don't think it's crested yet. We're also seeing, just, I would say, in a big way for the last year, kind of reassessment among news media, philanthropic startups, as well as established. I think you hear this in what the Washington Post is saying rather vaguely about the new kinds of content, but a realization that your ultimate purpose may be very serious and big investigations, accountability, but you need to be very aware of what it is your audience actually wants. And of course, the ways to sample that, which articles get read. I'd say it's an open-mindedness in creating more appealing products. And I guess I think, too, that if you can do that successfully, the site that aggregates quite a few things, as opposed to just having a narrower civic person, will do well. There's a interesting case in point in Baltimore, where a wealthy man tried to buy the Baltimore Sun, and he was rebuffed. So he put a lot of money into starting a new publication. So we now have his Baltimore banner alongside the Sun, and the banner has been very aware of that. It's digital only, so they don't have all these printing distribution costs. But it's become competitive fast, and it offers varied content. It doesn't blow off sports and entertainment and practical how to live well kinds of information as many of the new sites do. So those are a couple things. And I would say that the news media has pretty much moved past denial, that once you get a good thing, you can just kind of keep milking it. No, you're going to have to be agile in trying a lot of things, not all of which will work, and then finding some of the ones that do.
Okay, I know I said last question, but now I have to ask the follow-up. Do you think there's any chance that traditional newspapers will embrace AI rather than fight it?
I think so. Yes, I think I think part of what's going on is they're active in the exploration of how to do that. And I've always thought it's a good strategy to get your toe in the water in a small way, but to be there and be building some capability. And if you can't necessarily be the first mover, this is your strategy. But when some opportunities come along, you're not starting from a dead start. You have people who already have experience and have helped develop that body of information about how it can best be used.
That's Great. Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking. Good questions.
Thank you. I appreciate it.